Hey everybody, it's me, Steve Schnee, and you are watching the CD Junkie. On this episode of CD Junkie, I'm just going to talk about CDs. Well, not really CDs, but I'm going to be talking about music you can find on CD, but you can also find this music on vinyl. You can find it on cassette. You can probably find some of it on 8-track. I am talking 80s music. I do not understand why 80s music gets a bad rap. As you can tell, my channel sort of takes a hit because I talk about CDs and they're not in vogue, and I talk about 80s music and it's not in vogue. But it's the music that I discovered as it was coming out. It's the music that flipped my wig, so to speak. It is the music that I found so adventurous, so daring. I think the 80s is right now the last great gasp of creativity in music. I think in the 90s you got a band that climbed to the top 20, and then there were at least another 30 or 40 bands behind it. Sure, it happened in the 80s as well. It happened in the 60s and in the 50s. So, you had everybody jumping on different bandwagons. But beginning in the late 70s and early 80s, punk music, the whole punk movement that started with the Sex Pistols and the Clash and bands like that sort of morphed into post-punk, where bands were taking that energy and that vibe and that sound and maybe some of the anger, and they were creating music that was not punk. It was maybe you could have gone off in a droney direction or an experimental direction, or you could have gone off to sort of an angular, weird, jagged direction. Look at bands like Gang of Four and early Adam and the Ants. These are bands that were doing something different. Then you got the pub bands, which were great little pop bands, and they were working outside the punk arena. But then some of those bands started moving into sort of the post-punk, power pop, new wave. And then all of a sudden, all these great songwriters were climbing out of the woodwork. And that is what drove this whole 80s sound. It was, it could have been written on a keyboard. It could have been written on a guitar. It could have been written on a frickin' ukulele. It didn't matter. If it had a tune and it was catchy, then it was something that you needed to listen to, at least something that I needed to listen to. I'm a pop kid. I say that all the time. The 80s was filled with so much variety. I mean, you had goth, and that was dark, and you had experimental, and you had synth pop, and you had power pop, which was guitar fueled. Then you had new wave, which was guitar and keyboard fueled. And then you had different variations of that. You'd go off and you'd find Roman Holiday doing swing music. You'd find Joe Boxers doing, jazz meets Motown meets pop. You'd find all these bands doing this crazy, wonderful stuff. Even bands that splintered off, like let's say Adam and the Ants, they gave birth to Bow Wow Wow. And then they also gave birth to Wide Boy Awake, and Wide Boy Awake became Max. And it just became this swirling pool of wonderful music. You never knew what was going to hit the record shops. You could walk in and you could find China Crisis, this great Liverpudlian synth pop band, and it's going to be right next to a new release by Motorhead. And the stuff that I focus on is the more pop new wave. I have nothing against Motorhead or the new wave of British heavy metal or, anything like that. Or, the country stuff that was coming out at the time, or the R&B stuff that was coming out at that time. I got nothing against that. But the stuff that I really gravitated to was this new music, this new sound that was coming out of the UK, coming out of Australia, coming out of Italy, coming out of France, all these different countries. Every country had their own unique movements, different variations on things. The Stooges are thrust into the same category as the Ramones and New York Dolls and Sex Pistols and the Clash, and they're all very different from each other. But there was so much great music coming out. And it gets lambasted. People go, oh, yeah, the hairstyles, or Boy George, or, Mike Score from Flock of Seagulls. For me, it was always about the music. I would flip through the bins And sure, I'd look at the cover and go, do they look cool? Do they not look cool? But what was more important to me is turning it around, seeing what label it was on, seeing who produced it, and seeing, if they're, gosh, are they American? You have to remember that there was a whole American new wave scene going on at the same time the British new wave scene was going on, but the British stuff started getting played on American radio. And on the West Coast, we had bands like Oingo Boingo and X and the Dickies and all these bands that were punk, post-punk, quirky pop. And then on the East Coast, you had the Ramones, Talking Heads, etc. And everything is blending in together. But there's definitely bands that were only big on the East Coast and bands that were only big on the West Coast, bands that were only big in the Midwest, bands that were only big in Scotland and Australia and Italy and Austria. And sometimes it leaked out. Sometimes we got lucky and we got to experience Falco from Austria. And Falco did have several hits over here. Some people just say Rock Me Amadeus, but there's also Der Kommissar, and there was also Vienna Calling and a couple other minor hits. But there was so much great music coming out. And then Depeche Mode gave birth to Yazoo and Erasure. And, you had great punky bands that were influenced by the Ramones, like the Undertones, who I once read was the Irish Ramones. And because I like the Ramones, I bought that album, and that's how I got into that. I was buying this stuff when it was coming out. I got turned on to XTC on the third album, so I followed them, the Drums and Wires album. I heard Making Plans for Nigel, and my brain just went googly goo. And it was so amazing to hear that and to hear them grow. But then there's bands like from Holland, the Nits, who had a similar musical trajectory. I'm not saying they sounded like XTC, but they started off as really quirky and then became really earthy. Now, where XTC broke up, the Nits have continued, but they've become more artsy and avant-garde and not as immediate as their early stuff. But see, I can talk all day about this stuff. The thing that matters most is the way the music makes me feel. There's a trillion bands out there from the 80s that, like I said, a lot of people just scoff. Oh, new wave. Thing is this is music that changed people's lives. This is music that saved people's lives. And just because some of the stuff wasn't in the top 40, maybe not even in their home country, it still mattered. And these artists who created this music back in, when I talk about the 80s, I'm really talking about maybe the late 70s, 78, 79, up until about 86 or so. These bands that created music back then, there are some bands out there that are still creating music. Did you know that A Flock of Seagulls have a brand new album that just came out? I'm still waiting for my copy to show up. And then you've got people like Ian McNabb, who was the main singer-songwriter for the Icicle Works. He's still putting out music that rivals the Icicle Works output from 40 years ago. A lot of these artists, ABC, Martin Fry, he still tours as ABC. He may be the only original member, but every 5, 6, 7, 8 years puts out a new album, and it's always something you need to go out and get. China Crisis, another great band. You need to go out and get it. The Bluebells came back after a couple decades, and they put out a wonderful album. This is music that defies categorization. Like I said before, you could walk into a store and walk out with records that were synth pop, power pop, experimental, avant-garde, just whatever. You've got Jaluka from South Africa, and then you've got a lot of bands that incorporate world music and different styles. Kid Creole and the Coconuts. They were this big, colorful, wonderful band that mixed funk and soul and salsa and swing music and pop and created something unique and fun. The 80s was a lot of fun. That's what I gravitated towards, was the fun stuff. Was not a big fan of, let's say, Joy Division, but New Order, featuring 3 members of Joy Division, I'm game with them. Was not a big fan of Bauhaus, but I really dug Love and Rockets and Peter Murphy's solo career. Sisters of Mercy was a little too dark for me, but then I loved Spear of Destiny and Theater of Hate. So, and then, the great power pop bands, 2020, the Rubinoos, Shoes. The list, Paul Collins Beat, the list goes on and on and on. So much excitement coming out in the 80s. And for people to just brush it off and say, the 80s sucked. It's like, what were you only listening to the top 40 or the top 20 or the top 10? I'm not dissing top 40 music at all for any decade because it brings people joy. And that's really what it's all about. It makes people feel good. It, like I said before, it changes lives and it saves lives. But you always need to look outside of what is offered to you. I mean, when you walk into McDonald's and they say, buy this Big Mac meal, and you're going, no, I want a quarter pounder, or I want a McRib, or I want the 2 cheeseburger meal. You make your decision on what to buy. You don't just grab and eat whatever they put in front of you. You make your own choice, and that's kind of what Top 40 is. Top 40 is here's what's selling right now. Here's what the kids are buying. Here's what's being played on the radio. You are the one that decides, am I going to accept that, or am I going to push it aside and dig a little deeper? And that is really when you discover the things that are so fantastic about music. I'm talking about 80s music pop. And when I say pop, I don't mean top 40. Like I said, synth pop, new wave, power pop, whatever. You may be into 80s music, but you're into the metal. You may love the country. You may love the R&B and the soul. You may love the top 40 pop. There's nothing wrong with anybody liking anything, but and it could be any decade too. You could just be into just black metal or grindcore, anything like that. There's nothing there are no guilty pleasures in this world. If you're going to be an 80s fan and you're going to love Bucks Fizz, fan-friggin-tastic. If you've never heard Bucks Fizz, imagine an 80s British version of ABBA. That's kind of what they sound like. That's just sort of a, just trying to describe what they sound like if you ever wanted to check it out. If you have been spending the last 20, 30 years going, I want to hear a British version of ABBA from the 80s, get Bucks Fizz. It's always exciting. What I've done is I've put together a 7-minute medley featuring, 30 or 40 bands. A lot of them are popular bands and popular songs. But I threw in some there that maybe didn't catch on in your area. Maybe a lot of this didn't. Maybe this is going to be the first time. Maybe you're young, you're not an old guy like me, and you're going to experience some of these bands for the first time. Maybe you only heard stuff on the East Coast and you weren't exposed to a lot of the stuff that we were exposed to on the West Coast, vice versa. Maybe you're in Australia and you didn't hear some of the bands from the US or Scotland or Italy, whatever. This medley only features about 8 to 10 seconds, give or take a second or two, of a bunch of songs. And I've labeled who the bands are. You can look at their picture while you're listening to that 8 or 10 seconds. And I just kind of want you to experience the 80s again for about 7 minutes. It's just this long, uninterrupted flow of music. And I hope that what it does is either remind you of just how diverse the 80s scene was. I hope it brings back some good memories. I hope it exposes you to maybe some bands you haven't heard. And I hope that maybe if you're kind of not really into the 80s, but kind of want to dive in a little bit, I hope this sort of shows you some bands that you might go, yeah, that is something I'm going to check out. I like that sound, so I'm going to follow the Go-Go's, or I'm going to listen to 2020, bands like that. Anyway, please give this thing a listen. I spent a lot of time putting it together and then adding visuals and then adding artist titles. I hope that you enjoy it. And I'm not going to be offended if you shut it off or fast forward. Not at all. You do what you want to do. So sit back, relax, give this a listen, and I will see you on the other side.
Hey, you! Don't watch that! Watch this!
Our house in the middle of our street. Our house in the middle of where the pirate turns again. Oh, my country. We're gonna rock this town, rock it inside out. We're gonna rock this town, going underground, going underground. But if the brass bands play up, it starts a pound going underground. To cut a long story short, I lost my mind.
Anyway, that's it. I hope this inspires you to check out some of these bands, or maybe just dive into 80s music if you're not into 80s music. Whatever happens, I just appreciate you taking the time to watch this video, listen to that medley, and remember to like, comment, share, subscribe, to ring that bell for future notifications. And until the next time, remember me. I'm Steve Schnee, the CD Junkie.